We've got a great show coming up for you tonight. It's going to be heady. It's going to be academic. But if you want to understand how we got where we are today, you are not going to want to miss this conversation I'm going to have with Dr. Steve Turley. He appeared on my regional daily review program earlier today. Had to get him back in, and we had to expand upon that conversation. Dr. Steve Turley joining me on the WSMN Skype line when the program continues. Going to get that commercial break out of the way, and then an uninterrupted conversation with Dr. Steve Turley. Much more of the Keith Hanson Show coming up, folks, right after this. Please don't go away.
Before we begin, let's give a huge shout out to the sponsor of this video who keeps our lights on here. And that, speaking of lights, is the backup solar bank. In the midst of this whole emergency situation we find ourselves in, one of the best things you can invest in for your protection when the lights go out is what's called a solar power bank. It's a backup power bank that's obviously powered by the sun. It allows you to charge up to 2 devices at once. You'll never have to waste any money on batteries again. Now, supply is limited, and this is your very last chance to get yours at a 20% discount before they sell out. So do not wait. Click on that link below right now. Give you and your family the gift of power anywhere in the world. Click on that link below or visit backupsolarbank.com. That's backupsolarbank.com. You'll be glad that you did.
Welcome back to a Monday night edition of the Keith Hanson Show, powered by the Hegemony Report. A little Metallica, that'll get the blood pumping right there. One of those songs, I don't want to interrupt it. I just want to let it go. And actually, this was a request by tonight's guest. So I got to be honest with you. My hat's off to this gentleman's taste in music. And I told him earlier, under no circumstances would I play Nickelback or Alanis Morissette. That's where I draw the line. So Dr. Steve Turley is joining me on the WSMN Newsline. If you haven't heard of Dr. Turley, first of all, I mean, his credentials are impeccable. He's an internationally recognized scholar, speaker, and author who is widely considered to be one of the most exciting voices discussing today's intellectual dark web. He's the author of over 20 books, including The Return of Christendom, Demography, Politics, and the Coming Christian Majority, The New Nationalism, How a Populist Right is Defeating Globalism and Awakening a New Political Order. He's also the host of a very popular YouTube channel. You can just search for Dr. Steve Turley on YouTube. Without further delay and without further ado, Dr. Steve Turley, again on the WSMN Newsline. First of all, thank you so much for coming back onto my media. You were on my regional daily review today earlier, and once again, one of those conversations where I don't think either one of us expected it to go where it did, but it was a fantastic conversation, and I am super excited to get you back on and to continue to certainly to recap a little bit about what we talked about on the daily review, but then to build upon that because it was deep, man. It was deep. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Keith. And the Metallica just complements it perfectly. It is so awesome. We rock both intellectually and musically. So yeah,
it kind of made me wonder today during the regional programs. Like, I wonder how many people were really keeping up with this, or if they're like, all right, this really went over the head. When we started the conversation off by talking about what is the intellectual dark web, and to paraphrase what you had responded with, it is in essence the areas of the internet where that which cannot be discussed in academic circles gets discussed, sometimes ad nauseum, but it's one of those things that these are conversations that need to be had in order to be able to continue the discourse and continue moving forward and continuing to share ideas that may certainly be non-conventional at this precarious point in our history.
Absolutely. And at this point, at least, the internet does provide a platform where we're not falling victim to the cancel culture in the universities. If you think cancel culture is bad on social media, my heavens, you haven't seen anything until you go to a modern-day university, cultural Marxist-infested university. So we're finding that people, we were talking earlier about someone like Jordan Peterson or Dave Rubin has been really wonderful, actually, in providing a platform for precisely these kinds of conversations. We're able to talk very freely about the all kinds of dynamics that are going on all around the world that happen to be challenging post these politically correct orthodoxies. And we're finding that whereas the academy used to be a place where you can talk about these things quite openly and discuss and so on, those are increasingly being shut off from us. And so by God's grace, we've got this wonderful network known as the internet that's, as much as they try to cancel that, they're finding it's very, very frustrating with shows like yours and oh boy, just the alt media in general. It's the intellectual dark web is stronger than ever before, and it's becoming ironically, a place of quite wonderful enlightenment. So the darkness is just simply a tip of the hat to the fact that so many are discussing topics that are considered taboo among our most enlightened figures in society.
And I guess the logical starting point for a question here would be, why is it that this type of dialogue, Socratic dialogue or otherwise, needs to be relegated to something that I think a lot of people would cast off as being the bowels of the internet, the dark web? Well, why don't we have this conversation the way that two old guys would play chess in the park a decade ago?
Yeah, the university really, it started, right around, say 1000 AD, University of Paris, Oxford, Cambridge. They were primarily Christian institutions because the monasteries had the libraries, so they also had they were called dorms where people could stay and study, and they were wonderful places of intellectual growth and virtue formation alike that developed over the next 1,000 years into one of the most astonishing university systems the world had ever seen in the Western world. People came from all over the world to study there. I met my wife at a university that came from Japan, and it's just our universities were the envy of the world. But starting around the 1950s and 60s, right after World War II, you began to see this thing called cultural Marxism infest the culture of academia. Very, very quickly. It was largely through the manifestation of a group of scholars known as the Frankfurt School. They were a think tank at Goethe University in Frankfurt. These are guys like Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse, and they at the rise of Hitler, they ended up coming over to the United States, particularly Columbia University. They were all Marxists, and they introduced something called critical theory, which basically sought to redefine Marxism in terms of not contrasting power discrepancies and in the economy, but rather in culture. They thought economy was more a product of culture. And so they thought the university was the primary means by which they could convert at least the so-called, intellectual class towards this kind of thinking. And with the GI Bill after World War II, bringing all of these people into the universities, it really became kind of like the cardiovascular system that started spreading a lot of these leftist ideas. And what we found is, far from being very open and very tolerant and seeking to discuss sort of things, it is a rabidly tyrannical ideology that declares automatically, prima facie, before we're even able to discuss certain ideas, institutions, beliefs, traditions, religions, as automatically legitimate objects of disdain. And so they come up with just simple terms like it's bigoted and it's hateful and it's patriarchal and all kinds of phobia and the like. And that, by definition, allows the person not to even consider those ideas. To consider those ideas would be to participate in the hate that those ideas spread. So a lot of us have found ourselves kind of in an exodus, pushed out, which we're in many ways, like myself, perfectly happy with. I actually enjoy broadcasting far more. I like exchanging, the lectern for a microphone or the classroom for a camera. And a lot of us are doing that. Certainly Jordan Peterson's made an art out of that. And as a result, we're ironically reaching more people probably than we would ever reach if we were just confined to our dusty old lecture halls. So I think that's just kind of a broad picture, and you certainly could easily fill in a lot of the gaps there wherever you want to. But that's largely what's happened. The intellectual left today is not interested in discussion. We're finding this out more with CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times. They're not interested in two different perspectives and then allowing that dialectic, that dialogue to these two different logos going back and forth and finding the truth perhaps somewhere in the middle, considering both sides. They're not interested interested in that at all. Rand Paul actually just had a little interesting conflict with George Stephanopoulos of ABC, where Rand Paul pointed out, what you're saying is the left speaks truth and the right speaks lies. You're not a reporter anymore when you say that. When it came to this election, either you're factual, which means you're on the side of Joe Biden, you're on the side of Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, or you are spreading lies. And Rand Paul said, you've stopped being a journalist at that point. Now you're an advocate, and you're not considering that maybe there's two sides to this whole thing. And even just the whole notion of fact is a real interesting thing, because that has a 19th century origins to it, which we can get into. But actually, now we're just seeing the weaponization of fact in a way that is being used to basically excommunicate 50% of the population from the public square. And so what's happening to academia and so much of the conservative academics who are getting pushed out of the academy, that's just a microcosm of just this much larger social phenomena that's happening all across the country.
Well, when you talk about the willingness to debate or have the dialogue, and I think that largely comes in part from the I just contradicted myself. Largely, in part, when you look at the postmodern movement, which really is, I think, one of the finalizing nails in what we're seeing today. The postmodern movement, of course, stems from primarily French literary academics that were largely radical Marxists, and what they had to do by certainly the late 60s and early 70s was to acknowledge that in virtually every instance, I mean, and really we could say every instance, in which radical Marxism was attempted or implemented or experimented with, what you found was that these were necessarily producing evil empires, and they had to admit this. And I think, too, based on the research that I've done, the message originally from Marx and Engels, which was one of the haves versus the have-nots, the workers of the world united against the bourgeois class, this largely dynastic patriarchal system wherein the patriarch of the family would build a business, he would own the wealth, he would own the means of producing additional wealth, and then he would bequeath those means of producing wealth and the family wealth to his posterity. And how else would you break into that dynastic patriarchal system unless you were born into it? So we have to smash the bourgeois class. We have to rise up, and that was the message that Marx and Engels were sending to the populations of Europe. But in the United States, that message, I don't think, really resonated as much, because you had the ability to rise up out of virtually any socioeconomic demographic that you happen to be born into. I mean, we're not a caste system like the nation of India. You can be born into abject poverty, and utilizing the free market system and capitalism, you can build a very comfortable existence for yourself. You can go on to become phenomenally wealthy. There's really nothing holding you back except for your own stumbling blocks and your own excuses. So what you wound up seeing these postmodernists do was to now divide society. They started to play the identity politics game, and just as society in Europe was bifurcated along the haves, the have-nots dichotomy, you're seeing that in every other socioeconomic demographic and political demographic out there. It's blacks versus whites, it's whites versus everybody else, it's Christians versus Muslims, gays versus straights. I mean, think about it. Is there a single demographic that we are not divided in this country today? And that is the identity politics and the deliberate attempt to separate society into victim-oppressor classes that was pushed by these French postmodernists.
Yeah, no, it's brilliantly put. Yeah, in many ways, it goes back to what post-secular scholars are referring to as the Hegelian hope. It's named after Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Hegel, and just an Enlightenment guy, 18th century philosopher, who basically made the argument that reason, human reason, completely devoid of any tradition or custom or culture, human reason is enough to find peace and harmony and resolve any and all problems that we have. So you have Thomas Paine, in a sense, saying everything before us was the age of religion, and now we're entering into this glorious enlightenment at the age of reason. And so that built up in the 18th century philosophically, and then it started growing more in the 19th century in terms of technology and industrialization and the like. And Karl Marx just pushed that really toward a logical outworking in many respects. He basically said, in effect, that human reason alone can be used to overcome any and all human problems, and he created a sort of pseudo-scientific sociological conception of the world that imagined the world as made up of power discrepancies. So that's where that were primarily economic and class-based, and that's where reason has to be brought to bear to resolve the exploitations and the oppressions and the class distinctions and struggles that everybody was experiencing. Well, those who were on the wrong side of them. And it did seem rather successful in the 20th century as it got developed by some Soviet thinkers and the like. But it hit a lot of walls, and we found it was only going so far, and it seemed to also have some intellectual problems with it. So we were talking about this earlier, a fellow by the name of Antonio Gramsci, and there's another guy too named György Lukács, Hungarian writer and philosopher as well. Gramsci's Italian, but they both thought that what Marx missed is he missed the fact that class and economy were extensions of culture. And just like you said, the American culture was too resilient towards this, largely because of so much of our economic benefits that we have here, and how people weren't becoming communists. They just needed a boat ticket, in Europe and so on. They just needed a boat ticket to come on over here to the States, and all of a sudden they become entrepreneurs and shopkeepers, business owners, and the like, and just a stunning social success in terms of our entrepreneurial spirit that is America. And I got my PhD in Britain, and that's one of the things that when I chatted with people all throughout Europe, that's one of the things they recognize America's sort of brilliant with. They know that the vast majority of international patents are owned by Americans. I mean, I think it's gigantic. I haven't checked the exact number recently, but I think it was upwards around 90%. It was absolutely stunning. They see our ingenuity. They see that we work hard, that we love a sense of freedom and liberty to be able to build and create and to profit and then to help. I mean, that's our Protestant work ethic also involves being able to care for each other and to nourish. This was one of the arguments in the book, The Tragedy of American Compassion, where we had this notion going up to about the beginning of the New Deal, 1930s, that when to whom much is entrusted, much is also one bears much responsibility. And so we're supposed to share the fruits of our labors with our neighbors. That's why we worked hard and so forth, to be able to create good and thriving communities and the like. And then when the government starts institutionalizing that, taking it over in a one-size-fits-all program, that's when you do end up getting a lot of problems. And so anyway, they recognized that these new Gramsci and all, Lukács, they recognize that if there's going to be a Hegelian hope for the West that's going to truly resolve all the problems of religious wars and all the inequalities and the like, it's going to have to be found in culture rather than the economy. And then it only took the next generation, the Frankfurt School, to start embedding that in our educational institutions. And from there, again, like a connective tissue or like a cardiovascular system, it started making its way into our politics and our corporations and our economy and even our religion, our faith, and so forth. You've got the 5 Ps. I thought those were very helpful. Those were very impressive.
Yeah, just to recap. So when of course Antonio Gramsci talked about his theory of cultural and institutional hegemony, specifically changing the predominant worldviews by, in essence, co-opting the major institutions, the cultural institutions of a society. Daniel Pipes, the president of the Middle East Forum, came out and identified these cultural institutions using 5 Ps: professors, press, politicians, priests, and police. And I've actually had a couple of conversations with Daniel, and I've just, in my own research, I've expanded this out to now have 10 Ps: politicians, priests, press, police, prosecutors, parents, professors, poets, philanthropists, and the public. Nice. But when you look at all of these cultural institutions, they have all had their predominant worldviews co-opted. And just keeping it simple and using Daniel Pipes' 5 Ps, the professorial class, for instance. Now, when you look at secondary education, colleges and universities, what you're seeing now is an overwhelming amount of social Marxism, economic Marxism, that is being espoused as fact. And, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole with this, but when we start juxtaposing that concept with dialectics, Hegelian or otherwise, how can those dialectics exist in an environment where, as a core of postmodernism, the concept of debating various viewpoints of socioeconomics and sociopolitical issues becomes taboo because to debate is to validate, and they don't want to validate the other side's argument?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We're seeing a breakdown in being able to speak. I think, again, that's why our society's become so volatile, so violent. We were talking about it earlier, when you have a functioning democratic republic like ours, or just a democracy in general, it requires something that's known as the communication model of governance. And the communication model of governance is rooted in a natural law tradition, which basically states that even though you and I may be different religions or different ethnicities, different genders, and the like, nevertheless, we're all created in the image of God, and therefore we have the capacity to arrive at common understandings of the world and common senses of what's wrong, and perhaps common solutions and like. So that's the way. And then we vote on it, as it were, in accordance with certain Republican principles. And then we're willing to say, okay, maybe my side didn't win, but at least we're having this conversation, and this is good. We're moving largely through these cultural Marxists. We're moving at a time where we have entire generation of people were being taught that if you're a different race, or if you're a different gender, if you're a different sexual orientation, you have what's called a radical perspective of life that they're trying to oppress. They're trying to impose these people outside of your group are trying to impose their group's norms and protocols and standards of evaluation on you. And so you become a victim, you become oppressed. And that's what happened over these last 2,000 years to your group. So now what you need to do is you need to liberate yourself by not even having conversations with them, by living life on your own terms. It's what's known as the fancy term we came up with in our previous conversations called radical perspectivalism. And it's ironic because our media elite are scared to death of white supremacism, for example. And when you read some of the articles or even some of the studies in academics, and they look at the alt-right and so forth, what they fault it for, believe it or not, is because it's dangerous because it engages in radical perspectivalism, that they can't think outside of their race. But when you look at BLM activists, or when you talk to Antifa, well, you don't talk to them, you listen to them, and you talk to some of these really hardcore cultural Marxists, you see the very same radical perspectivalism. I mean, I have a theory on that, in the sense that I think the world is ironically moving to the right, no matter what the right defined more tribalistically as over and against globalistically. That would be more the left. So the right and left I wouldn't see so much as economic or even ideological terminology as it would be in the 20th century. I see it more as identity oriented. And the irony to that is, if the world is kind of breaking apart into tribalisms, moving away as it has been since the fall of the Soviet Union, just kind of breaking up because the old Cold War order is dead and postmodernism is taking over. I know the postmodern Marxists, the cultural Marxists, are trying to hold it all together with their ideology. I don't think they can do it. We're already seeing, Keith, which is really interesting, as you know, we're already seeing the identity politics starting to bite back on each other. So the Muslim group is starting to bite back against the LGBT group. We saw that particularly in Birmingham in England recently. So they're not, and then Latinos are biting back against the Afrocentricity, and so it's starting to balkanize on its own. But that's what I mean. I think we're all kind of moving to the right, and either either we embrace sort of a civic nationalism, which is what President Trump tried to do, and what Ronald Reagan certainly affirmed and the like, where we're all united. We're polyethnic, but we're all united by common cultures, customs, traditions. In the West, it's generally our Christian tradition that holds us together. Or we balkanize into, ironically, these very tribalistic tendencies that the media is so freaked out about white supremacists and the alt-right. Well, my argument is, well, you're being quite myopic here, because you're seeing precisely those tendencies and dynamics and sentiments on your side with BLM and La Raza and all these other, just even hardcore feminist groups that are implementing every bit the radical perspectivalism that you see in white supremacy, but in leftist terms. They use more of these cultural Marxist terms, so therefore it's allowed, or therefore it's sanitized or something. It's a big joke in the end. In the end, it is a very vicious and divisive belief system. Again, bringing us full circle to your original observation that just everywhere we look, we're being, parents are being pitted against their kids, and, your body's being pitted against your gender identity that you feel inside, and on and on. It's just one dialectic after another.
Now, I hope everybody is listening carefully and has their number 2 pencils ready, because there could be a pop quiz at the end of this. We're only 25 minutes into this, and I mean, it's unbelievable. I was getting text messages from people earlier today that were just saying, my head is swimming.
That's right.
And see, that's what we do, is we do the research, we have the conversations, and we bring you the information in a relatively easy to understand and digest format, I would certainly hope. Joining me on the WSMN Skype line tonight is Dr. Steve Turley, internationally recognized scholar, speaker, and author of a number of very, very popular books, The Return of Christendom, Demography, Politics, and the Coming Christian Majority, and The New Nationalism, How the Populist Right is Defeating Globalism and Awakening a New Political Order. You can also follow him, at least for the time being, until he gets deplatformed from YouTube. Just search for Dr. Steve Turley on YouTube. And of course, that is a daily showcase of his understanding of the rise of nationalism, populism, and traditionalism throughout the world. All right, so now we got to give more people more information here for that quiz that could be coming up here in just a little bit. The way that I see this radical perspectivalism tying in with another concept. I'm going to throw another really heady academic term at you here, called phallogocentrism, which was a term that was derived by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, that refers to the privilege of the masculine in the construction of meaning. Fallo from the, obviously from the word phallus, the male sex organ, logo, logic, and centrism relating to or of directly. This is a philosophy that was used to describe, and I'm looking at this as the radical perspectivalism that other people would put forth in an attempt to preserve and protect their way of life, which ultimately gives them wealth and the means of producing additional wealth. I just want to step in. Is that a good way to describe it in layman's terms?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so right. Yeah. Back in the day, society centered around family, faith, and community. Those are the basic building blocks of any kind of society. They still remain so today in most parts of the world. The family structure will be largely patriarchal. There's going to be a faith structure that holds that together, and then a community that manifests particularly the ethical norms of that faith. So absolutely, yeah.
So when you look at what Derrida was describing, he's basically saying that you would argue your version of reality. And again, this is where this concept of postmodern, and notice what I just said, your version of reality. And what this stems from, again, and people ask this, well, how can French literary academics affect politics? Well, think about this. When you were in 10th grade or 11th grade, were you asked to interpret a Shakespearean soliloquy? Or were you asked to read a Robert Frost poem and asked, what was the poet trying to say? What is the artist trying to say? And in the French academic circles, they realized that there was no right or wrong interpretation of a literary work. The first thing you need to do in order to interpret a literary work is to look at a word and understand what that word means. And then you have to look at the word in the context of the sentence. and understand what the sentence is trying to convey. And then you interpret the sentence in the context of the paragraph in which that sentence appears. And then you interpret the paragraph in the context of the chapter in which that appears. And then you interpret the chapter in the context of the entirety of the literary work that it happens to appear in. And so there is no right or wrong interpretation, because each individual is interpreting that literary work based upon their own unique personality, which doesn't necessarily jibe with this concept of the blank slate model or tabula rasa theory. We can get into that here in a second. But if you are arguing your version of reality from what you know and have come to know as reality, then you are oftentimes arguing that version of reality based upon your own masculinity, if you happen to be a male, your whiteness, if you happen to be white, your Christianity, if you happen to be Christian, and that which allows you to obtain wealth and gain additional wealth. And so ultimately, at its core, all dialogue, political, economic, social dialogue, ultimately boils down to this theory that people are simply arguing based upon power structures and power hierarchies. And discussion validates viewpoints and those power hierarchies. It's built into the philosophical system of postmodernism. So if you and I engage in dialogue and try to find common ground, well, that's part of the oppressive patriarchal power struggle, and therefore you have validated my viewpoints and I have validated your viewpoints simply by my willingness to engage in a dialogue about them. And so the easiest way to invalidate your version of this oppressive patriarchal game or power struggle that we're playing is simply not to engage you in dialogue at all. In essence, to debate you is to validate you.
Yeah, beautifully put. Yeah, you need to be defeated, not debated. That's where we are. I know a lot of people might feel like, oh my gosh, what is it? But what you said, it makes so much sense after you get educated into imbecility, as Malcolm Muggeridge once referred to it as, our modern day academies. We go in. It's a sad thing. You see a 5-year-old, 6-year-old go on first day of kindergarten, and they're so excited, and their eyes are filled with wonder and awe. And then you see the same child, 13 years later, graduating high school, cynical and flippant, and would scoff at the notion that she can really know anything at all. And, it's a really, really sad thing. It's one of the most beautiful, as we could breathe a little air here, one of the most beautiful developments over the last few decades has been the rise of homeschooling and classical Christian education, a recovery of the kind of education that all our founding fathers had, where students are learning the true, the good, and the beautiful through the great books and great art and music. And that's making a vicious comeback, which is lovely. It's part of that retraditionalization we were talking about earlier. But there's no question. If you think about it, this is just the Hegelian hope pushed to its logical outworking. If you have reason and only reason, only human reason, right? Assuming no fall, which that every religious belief system holds to in some way, shape, or form, every ancient philosophical tradition, in some way, shape, or form, the human person is fallen. You don't trust your own reason by itself. That's a foolhardy thing. Anyone who trusts their reason has a fool for a master. So, but nevertheless, the Hegelian hope said, no, reason is our ticket out of the mess that, they would have said that religion is made of the world and all the wars and all that sort of stuff. But then you push reason out to its logical outworking, and what do you get? You end up getting this postmodern realization that, everyone's got their own reason. Everyone's got their own way of thinking, their own perspective of the world, their own perceiving of the world. And then we're all creatures caught up in these arbitrary cultures and traditions. Remember, in the modern period, the Enlightenment period, the devil's bargain that they made in order to marginalize religion is they said that science and scientific rationality was the only way we could know. Now, we've always affirmed science. It was known as scientia, as going all the way back to the Greeks. We always affirmed science, but we believed the scientific way of knowing the world was incomplete without what they called theory. And theory is discerning the divine meaning and purpose inherent in the world. And that enabled us to cultivate a sense of wisdom and virtue in our students. In the 18th century, they tried something a little different. It was pretty radical. And the This is why they're called moderns in the first place. And you can't understand postmodernity without the moderns in the first place. Modern in the sense that they're trying something that had never been tried before. And that was, let's define knowledge solely in terms of scientific rationalism, solely in terms of what's popularly known today as facts and factual knowledge. It's not a matter of opinion whatsoever. It's only a matter of objective reality arrived at through the scientific method of, hypothesis, experimentation, and then verification or falsification. And so anything that failed that test or could not be subjected to that test, like love, for example, or truth in its ultimate sense, goodness, beauty, meaning, God, it's himself, all of that is just pushed out of the realm of what can possibly be known. And so now we're going to just operate with scientific rationalism as the one true way of knowing. Well, the problem is immediately then we recognize the world changes. The world is no longer filled with divine meaning and purpose, as every single belief system on the planet believed up until that point. It's no longer filled with, just think of the Genesis account. God said it was good, and it was good. Every time he created, and it was good. There's a value system infused into the world around us, and that value system means that while ham sandwiches are good, humans are infinitely more good, and so we've got a value hierarchy, so we can make decisions. If a ham sandwich is falling and a baby is falling, and I rush to save at the same time they're falling, and I rush to save the ham sandwich, that's bad, and it's because I've dislodged my desires and my conception of things apart from this divine economy of goods. And so in the modern world with the Enlightenment, that whole divine vision disappears because we only know scientifically now. So the world is completely reduced to biology, chemistry, and physics and no more. And so then what is meaning? What is culture? What are all these customs and traditions that I have? Well, that's just, those are personal meaning systems that we splash on otherwise meaningless biological, chemical, and physical processes. Think of the art, modern art technique of taking the white canvas and just splashing a can of paint on it and say, look at that, that's art. Well, that's the modern world. The modern world said the world is just, a blank canvas. It's no divine meaning. It's all biology, chemistry, and physics. And then culture superimpose meaning and purpose onto an otherwise meaningless, purposeless world. And what postmodernists do is they call the bluff and they say, oh, you mean like scientific rationalism? You say, oh, you mean like knowing the world solely through science? Isn't that just another arbitrary cultural value system that we're splashing onto a meaningless world? And so the Hegelian hope's unraveling. You see, reason hasn't been able to figure it all out because reason itself doesn't have any inherent meaning or purpose. And so everything now is getting deconstructed. The family's getting deconstructed. Religion's getting deconstructed. Gender's getting deconstructed. Everything is being seen as basically a charade. It was a fraud. It's like the Russian collusion fraud, right? This notion of Islam. Well, they won't say that because that's going to be a minority ethnicity and religion that's allowed in what's left of our cultural Marxism. So they'll pick on Christianity generally, and they'll say, oh, well, it's all fraud and here's how. Or they'll look at the traditional role of men in society. Oh, it's all a fraud and here's how. They'll look at Western civilization and everything that's accomplished and go, oh, it's all a fraud and here's how. So you're really just seeing the absolute unraveling of society. But wouldn't that include postmodern claims themselves? And of course, the answer is yes. And that's why I think more and more they're saying, well, then the conversation is ended. We can't talk anymore. And so now it's just power. And then ironically now they're going back to the traditions and the customs, but they're rooted generally in race and ethnicity. So the kind of the Wakandification of religion, and so any religion that claims to be able to transcend race, gender, and the like Christianity does, tends to be subject by definition.
You are listening to the Keith Hanson Show, powered by the Hagman Report on this Monday, the 25th day of January 2021, program number 824. Don't forget, too, the show archives are back, available through iHeartRadio, iTunes, Spreaker. You can always download them as a podcast. My guest tonight, Dr. Steve Turley. He joins me on the WSMN Skype line. You know, it's interesting you're talking about the assaults on rationality and science, because the way that I see it, postmodernism has become a complete assault on everything that has been established since the Enlightenment period, that 1715 to 1790 century of philosophy. Rationality, science, clarity of mind, dialect, concept of the individual, all of these things are assaulted by postmodernism. And as a matter of fact, taking that one step further, in 1988, Alan Bloom wrote a book called The Closing of the American Mind, and he noticed that leftist groups had moved into any discipline with no objective measures and standards, i.e. the non-STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, and business major disciplines. But now, since Alan Bloom wrote that in 1988, certainly the science has been co-opted as well. They have started to move into that because, well, now you see the notion of climate change and that becoming settled science, and this being accepted as settled science by people who are not scientists. But they are now starting to take that postmodern interpretation of facts and changing the narrative and changing the dialogue, even in some of those STEM fields.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the politicization of knowledge that researchers have talked about. We actually do. We have some very interesting studies that have found that scientists are very hesitant in general to pursue any line of experiment or reasoning that would challenge politically correct norms. They just don't want the heat. Again, just look at what happened to Jordan Peterson. They just don't want the heat. And that's despite the fact that even if the evidence goes in that direction. So we have a very radical, because political correctness goes all the way back. If your listeners are like, why are they talking about this cultural Marxism stuff? It's a postmodernist making my head hurt. But this is political correctness goes right back to this stuff with Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s and his conception of repressive tolerance that you can read about online. Just read look up Marcuse, Marcuse, and tolerance. That's all you need, and you can read his essay on how anything that violated the assumptions and the aspirations of minority cultures is by definition to be rejected and cast out from any serious consideration. Anything that affirmed Western civilization, anything that affirmed precisely what you were talking about here, the good things about the Enlightenment and the like, nope, that has to be cast out immediately. That's not allowed. So what we're finding is that even scientists themselves are subject to the most radical politically correct norms, and they go even the other way. Not only do they avoid things that challenge politically correct orthodoxy, but they actually accept, they admit that they accept those politically correct standards despite the fact that there's no evidence for it, which is really fascinating. These are our scientists here. So science itself has been increasingly weaponized. It's increasingly going through its own process of deconstruction and relativization and the like. We're all going to suffer for it in some way, shape, or form. But I think the good news is that, like what Jordan Peterson is showing, and a number of others, there is a Douglas Murray would be another one. He's more of a philosopher and thinker. But there is a massive backlash going on against this, and it's not a backlash solely by, say, conservative Christians or ideological conservatives and so forth. No, this is very much what we call populist backlash that includes people like Dave Rubin, who's a gay man who's married, and Douglas Murray as well. So you would think in 1990s arrangements he'd be on the left, he'd be fully pro Bill Clinton Democrat kind of thing. These guys are identifying absolutely with, let's say, a pro-Trumpist right at this point, because they recognize that political correctness is a well, they would call it quite literally a cancer that's destroying any semblance of public good, of public discussion and dialogue. And these men, to their credit, love freedom. They love true liberty far more than they love, sort of politically correct categories that they're supposed to be following in terms of their political sentiments. So we're seeing a very, very large coalition form, as it were, that sees politically correct sensibilities as being very specific to a permanent political class and a globalist class that really cares nothing about nation, culture, custom, tradition. Well, good. That's saying it mildly. They really hate nation, culture, custom, and tradition. They find it vile and they want it destroyed. And they're standing up with us. So, and this coalition is growing bigger and bigger every day. There's even the rediscovery of Christianity here. So you're seeing the former, like Christopher Hitchens, disciples like Carl Benjamin, who's also known as Sargon of Akkad. That's his YouTube name. It'd be somebody like him, or even Dave Rubin, who would have considered himself an atheist at one point, spending a lot of time with Jordan Peterson. They were on the road together, I think, for a month. And it was then that these guys were suddenly realizing, wait a minute now, religion is actually, it's indispensable to the protection of our freedoms and a flourishing culture and a flourishing nation, and having a sense of, like St. George's Cross in England or something like that. Or St. Stephen in Hungary. There is a sense that this is what holds us together. And if we don't have a meaning system that holds us together and gives us guidance in how to live a good life and for the sake of the good of the other, we're shot. And of course, postmodernism doesn't have any of that. That's why I think it tends to be so vitriolic and angry. What final thing? I don't mean to be rambling here, Keith, but I did see on Twitter a radical Marxist group, kind of Antifa group, with their signs saying, haters and abortion for everyone and so forth. And they film themselves on their phones going into a cathedral and interrupting a Catholic mass. I don't know if you saw it. And for about 2 minutes, you see it, and all they did is scream, haters, you vile effing haters. And you're looking at this going, the only hate I'm seeing is the venom that's just being spewed from you people. And that's kind of the bizarre world that cultural Marxism and the Hegelian hope has unfortunately collapsed into. And alas, it's going to take some time to work itself out.
Well, the one thing we've said on this program before is that whenever the left or their foot soldiers or anybody on their side of the aisle makes an accusation, you can take it to the bank that it's a twisted, projected confession, and that's a perfect example.
Nice.
And we can literally sit here and make a game out of listing off. We could do bullet point lists of all of the different instances in which the left is intolerantly hypocritical. But I think people have heard that narrative so many times before. You bring up a really interesting point, though, when we start talking about political correctness, because political correctness, and I identified this when I first got on the airwaves going back to 2010, was that I saw political correctness as a means of circumventing the First Amendment. You have the right to say something, but political correctness creates an environment wherein if you say the wrong thing, you are necessarily uncomfortable, and if you want to avoid being made to feel uncomfortable, that you'd better not engage in that type of speech. And, more to the point, I think Darrell Lamont Jenkins, who's a famous social justice warrior, he appeared in a Netflix documentary called The Alt-Right. He talks about hate speech, which, of course, is political correctness now taken to a further level. But I want you to hear this soundbite from Darrell Lamont Jenkins and give me your thoughts on this.
Sure.
Hate speech is protected under the First Amendment, but that doesn't mean it's protected by ethics. It just simply means that they don't go to jail for it. But if what you say does cause some sort of harm, people are allowed to respond.
I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, if you say something to people that that hurts somebody else, you're not going to go to jail for it. In essence, what we're going to do is we're going to try you in this kangaroo court of public opinion. And so we are going to dox you. We're going to cancel you. We're going to cost you your job. We're going to cost you your livelihood. We're going to break up your marriage. We're going to, have your kids pulled away from you. If you dare go against the political correct environment, we are going to make you wish that you were actually being tried and imprisoned. That would be a dream compared to what we're going to do to you in the court of public opinion.
Yeah, so right. Character assassination is a form of assassination. It's a social death, no question about it. Yeah, it reminds me something again that our Western civilization has, I think most cultures do, most civilizations have, that unfortunately our modern left doesn't, is the biblical distinction between sin and crime. So while all crimes are sins, not all sins are crimes. And I think our natural law-based, Christian-defined natural law-based American Republic recognize that. There are going to be some things that people say they're pretty vile, pretty horrible, pretty terrible, and are very sinful. And there will be, if they grew up in a good family and a faith and community, that's going to be generally limited. But nevertheless there's going to be people like that. We recognize there's a difference between that and, say, murder or rape, where these are horrific crimes that are penalized under our laws. But not all sin is. And again, we have to be a bit empathetic. This is part of our Christian tradition. Is that but by the grace go I, but by the grace of God go I. I mean, I am every bit as prone to falling like that person has. And as long as it does not fit into the parameter of an actual crime, and those crimes defined, very strictly and very specifically, so as to avoid the bill of, violating Bill of Rights and so on. As long as that's the case, then we accepted it. We didn't like it necessarily, but we accepted the fact that we are in a sinful world and we're sinful people. There is a means of redemption. And then if it does go into the realm of an actual crime, then it will be punished. The left doesn't know any such distinction. For them, sin is crime. Any sin you and I commit is a legitimate basis for our eradication, at least socially. And again, we were talking about this earlier. This all is rooted in what cultural anthropologists would call taboo systems. And a taboo system we have to be very careful with, because everybody's got them. Everybody has a taboo system of some kind. There are just some places you don't go. Even South Park. South Park is not going to make fun of Islam the way it'll make fun of Christianity. They've got their own taboo systems. Taboo systems are just they're things you just don't go to, you don't touch. But cultural anthropologists have also recognized that the great religions of the world have lasted for so many thousands of years, largely because, ironically, their taboo systems are very lenient. They tend to have very clear taboo systems, and they tend to be on the periphery of society. And there's also a lot of redemption and forgiveness, particularly in the Christian faith, that is offered around the violating of those taboo systems. And the advantage is as long as you have a taboo system, then you can recognize what's normal and what is good and flourishing in your society. It's very much like an immune system. It recognizes threats and it's able to get rid of those threats. But you've got to define those threats very, very, very broadly so as to be able to adapt to new norms in society. So we're talking about religions that have lasted centuries, and they've been able to adapt because their taboo systems tend to be very, very broad-based. We're dealing now with what I think is a very real religion, no question about that, a bad one, but a very real one, has every bit as much a taboo system in the sense of the sacred and confessions of faith and ideology and saints and all that, Marx and all that. But it hasn't had to survive over the centuries. It hasn't had to adapt. And so what it's doing is it's defining its taboo system, not broadly, but very, very specifically, to the point where you could be excommunicated even for calling a virus the wrong name. It's that ridiculous. And what we're going to find is it has no way of adapting to society and its dynamisms and its changes. And so this distinction between sin and crime is a real important one, especially for adaptation. And unfortunately, the left knows no such distinction.
I have some bad news, my friend. On two different fronts. Number one, we are out of time. So that means we have to end this conversation. And number two, we are not going to be able to do that pop quiz because we are flat out of time. Dr. Steve Turley, I want to thank you so much. And I would encourage people to check out your Facebook channel. Just search for Dr. Steve Turley on YouTube. And also check out your website as well, too. That's Turley, Turley, talks.com. That's turleytalks.com. Dr. Steve Turley, I got to get you back on the program again. This has been, I think, probably the fastest 50-something minutes that we've done fun. It's incredible. But I really appreciate the insight.
Thank you for all the work that you're doing. I know you're doing your own projects. They sound fantastic. I really want to keep up with them. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Keep in touch. God bless, my friend. Thank you again.
God bless you, man.
All right. And that is all the time that we have for the Monday night edition of the Keith Hanson Show. Man, that was a great conversation. That's a guy I could sit there and have a single malt scotch and a cigar with for hours, Dr. Steve Turley. I will be back tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for the Daily Review and at 9 p.m. Eastern Time for the Keith Hanson Show. Until then, folks, have yourself a wonderful Monday evening. Stay safe, be well, and remember, civility does work. Please be nice to one another. Have a great Monday evening. Talk to you tomorrow.